Hello, I'm Anika from Made to Sew. In this tutorial, I'm going to be sharing with you how to create one of these cute leather purses. Now this purse is actually plain. And so in this tutorial, I'm going to be going through the tips and techniques that you need to make this purse and to try and have a professional finish. I'm then going to create two different tutorials where I'm going to give you two different designs. We've got the bow purse and also a purse with a little frill on the front. Now these tutorials are going to be much shorter and I'm going to simply look at the design and how to create that design. So you will need to refer back to this tutorial for the basic tips and techniques and construction. Let's start by looking at what you will need. So the first thing you're going to need to decide upon is your fabric. Now you can choose to work with a leather hide, you can use smooth leather, or you can use a suede. If you're a complete beginner, I would recommend that you go with the suede choice. The problem when sewing leather is that the needle goes into the leather and creates a hole. Therefore, if you get it wrong and want to unpick it, you can see the holes. With suede, you have a little bit more forgiveness because of the nap of the suede. If you don't want to use real leather, you can obviously use faux leather, or you could use another fabric that doesn't fray, so such as oilcloth or something like that. The reason why I say you want to use a fabric that doesn't fray is because I haven't finished the edge of the frill or the edges of the bow. So if you want to use something that frays, you're obviously going to need to think about finishing those edges. You're also going to need some interfacing, and we're going to interface the leather to give the purse a bit of support, but also you'll probably find that if you don't interface it, the leather can stretch as you're working with it, and it can shift and slip and move as you're feeding it through the sewing machine. So you're going to want to find a nice interfacing to support that. Now this interfacing is a 100% cotton and it's fusible. So you can iron or fuse the interfacing onto leather if you're working with leather. You just need to be careful and do lots of testing first. Leather can withstand heat, but it's the steam that you have to just be cautious of to make sure that you don't get the leather wet and cause any staining. Now this interfacing that I've got here works wonderfully with leather, so I'm going to sell some of this on my website because I've been looking for something as good as this for a long time. Now you're also going to need a zip. Now, as we go through the tutorial, I'll explain the templates and the sizes that I'm working with. However, I'm also going to write a corresponding blog post that shows you how to make your own size based upon the zip. So take a look at that if you want to make a different size to what I'm working with. For this tutorial, I'm using a 4-inch 10cm zip. You can use metal teeth, you can use plastic teeth, it's up to you. Then you're also going to need some thread. When it comes to thread, you can work with your standard polyester thread, there's no problem with that. But you might want to think about purchasing a top stitching thread if you want the stitches to really be visible on the leather. If you can't get a top stitching thread in your colour, then you can actually use 2 threads through the top of the machine. And that will just give a slightly thicker finish to the top stitching. So we've looked at the fabric, the zip, the interfacing that you're going to need to create these purses. But let's also look at the tools that you might find useful. So if you're working with leather, we're going to draw the template onto the wrong side of the leather. Therefore, you're going to need a ruler of some description. Whether it's centimetres or inches, it's up to you. The templates work in both. You're also going to need a pen. A biro is fine, or a gel pen, something that you can see clearly when we're marking on the wrong side of the leather. And you can do the same thing if you're working with oilcloth or another fabric. Now think about how you want to cut out your leather as well. Obviously, you're welcome to go with scissors, which might be how you normally cut out your dressmaking projects. If you decide to use scissors though, just be careful that you don't move the leather. You don't want it to stretch out of shape. So check once you've cut it out that it's the size it should be based on your template measurements. Another way to prevent it from shifting is to actually fuse your interfacing on first and then draw out your template and cut it out. That will help to prevent it from stretching and shifting. Now other methods that you can use are a rotary cutter or perhaps a craft knife. Now I personally tend to go with a craft knife. I obviously use a ruler to protect my fingers and I have a mat on the table to make sure that I don't damage my table. Now, when it comes to sewing leather, we obviously can't use pins because a pin is going to make a hole in the leather and going to damage it, and that potentially could be visible. So you're going to need to get yourself some bulldog clips or some wonder clips. And wonder clips are just easier to use bulldog clips basically, and that's going to hold the layers together as you're sewing it. Now, if you struggle with those, or if you want another method, you can actually use some adhesive. You can either use some double-sided basting tape. This is a good option, and I'll show you how to use this later on in the tutorial. Or you can use for some parts of it some adhesive, some temporary adhesive. But there'll only be a few sections where you can use that. I would suggest that the basting tape is probably a little bit better. You just don't want to use it everywhere because it can cause your needle on the sewing machine to become a little bit gummy and sticky. Now, when it comes to feeding the leather through the sewing machine and having a professional finish and helping your sewing machine to really feed the leather through well, I would recommend using a walking foot. Unfortunately though, we can't use this for much of the purse because of the zip that we're inserting. So you are going to need to have a standard zipper foot too. If your machine really struggles feeding the fabric through, you could try purchasing some stabiliser. Some tearaway stabiliser is a good idea, and you could put that on either the bottom or the top of the fabric depending on where it's struggling. Now, the first thing that you're going to need to do is to cut out the template that you're working with. Now, please don't worry that the centimetre to inch conversion isn't correct. I have actually designed these so that they're correct in inches and correct in centimetres. So make sure that you just stick in 1 inches or centimetres and all will be fine. Now, prior to cutting out with your leather is one last thing. You need to check the front of your skin or hide. The reason why we need to do this with leather is because it's a natural product. So you can find that there are scars, there are some marks that you don't want on your purse. So what I recommend that you do is you really have a look over the right side of the leather and you mark any of these markings with a sticker or with a pen onto the wrong side, because you're going to be working from the wrong side when you draw out your template. And unfortunately, the markings that you see on the wrong side might not be the same as the markings that are visible on the right side. And that's all that matters to us. Now, if you're working with suede, you also want to think about the nap. With suede, if you brush it in one direction, it will be lighter than if you brush it in the other. It can be a slightly darker colour. You just need to make sure that you cut out your purse going in the same direction. So on both sides, the front and the back, the top is going in the same direction. So you have some consistency. What I tend to do is to find which way the nap is going and to put a little arrow on, again on the wrong side of my suede, just to remind me that the suede is going down in this direction. So let's look at the template size you're going to need to cut out and we can begin working on this project. To make the plain purse, you're going to need to cut out the following. Now you're going to want to mark the details for the shape of the bag that you're making onto the wrong side of your leather. Think about the direction if you're working with suede or with a pattern that the nap is going in, and I generally have a little arrow that I put onto the wrong side of my leather so that I know that this is the top and the suede is going down this way, or the nap is going down that way. Now you're going to want to measure it on with a ruler and draw it on, and you can either use a biro or you can use a gel pen. I often work with sort of silver or gold colourways. I find that they show up on most colours, but that probably doesn't show up very clearly for you to see, so I could use a black marker as well if I wanted to. And I would simply measure that on, making sure that all of my lines are square and parallel to one another and as they should be. Now you're going to want to cut around the markings that you've made, and you can do that either using a pair of scissors, or the method that I would usually use is basically a craft knife and a mat, but it's up to you, the method that you like the best. Just try and be careful that you're not stretching the leather in any way. You want to keep it as flat as possible when you're cutting everything out. Now for the plain purse, you should have 2 pieces, one for the front and one for the back. These should measure a width, so crossways here, of 6¼ inches, which is 14.6 centimetres, and a height of 4.5 inches, which is 11.5 centimetres. You should also have 2 tabs for the end of the zip, and these measure 1.5 inches wide, which is 3.5 centimetres, and 1 inch high, which is 2 centimetres. And you're going to need 2 of those as well. A little tip when cutting out is that you want to make sure you cut off or remove any of the pen markings. On some of the pieces, that's really important because you otherwise would see the pen markings if we're not finishing the edge. Before we move on to the sewing, I would recommend that you interface the wrong side of the front and back pieces. Don't worry about the little tabs here, just the main pieces. Now, you can interface leather. You're going to want to do so on the wrong side, and you're going to want to use heat and steam as you normally do. However, you're going to want to be careful because when it comes to leather, suede, things like that, it's going to be the steam or the water that could mark it. So you're going to want to find an interfacing that will work best with more heat and less steam. And obviously this does depend on your iron. So just test it first and check that you're not damaging your fabric or leather when you're doing this. Now this interfacing here is what I'm using. It's a 100% cotton woven interfacing. It comes in natural white or black, and this is actually not designed for leather, but it's got a special purpose for leather because it fuses really well onto the wrong side of it. If you feel that the leather may stretch or move around as you're cutting, you're welcome to actually interface the leather or your fabric first. This is a technique called block fusing. So you'll fuse the whole of the wrong side of the area that you're going to cut these shapes from, and then you'll draw it and cut onto them. Whichever method you use, just make sure that the interfacing is really well attached onto the wrong side. Now the first step in the tutorial is to take your zip, and we're going to take our tabs. Now the tabs are going to be folded in half with the right side on the outside, and these are going to sit at the end and at the start of the zip, and we're going to want to wrap them around the zipper tape. Now, as you can see, there's a bit of a gap here between the end of the zip and the start of the tab. So we're going to need to trim down the zipper tape slightly. Now you can do this by eye with the tab folded in half. You can clearly see how much you're going to need to trim off the bottom of the zipper. It's going to be approximately 1/8 or 3mm, but it does depend on the brand of zipper that you're working with. So I'm going to trim that off with a small pair of scissors, just like so. And then I can wrap my tab around it. I'm going to aim for the tab to be central on the zipper, and you want the underside of the tab to be coming under and joining the top side so that the underside and the top side, the edge finishes in the same place. Obviously we can't pin leather, so we're going to hold this on with these little wonder clips, or you could use bulldog clips. Ready for us to take this to the sewing machine. Now just like with the bottom end of the zip, we're going to do the same at the top end. Again, you're going to need to trim off a small amount of the zipper tape. And then you're going to take the other tab. Now because the zip opens here, this bit's a little bit trickier. You're going to want to fold the tab in half with the right side facing out, and we're going to want to basically hold the 2 edges of this closed. So the 2 edges at the top of the zipper need to be closed. And we're going to wrap the tab around it. Again, you're going to want to use 2 of the little wonder clips or bulldog clips to hold that in place. Now at the sewing machine, we're simply going to attach the tab onto the zip. Now you're probably going to need your zipper foot for this, and depending on the fabric that you're working with, you might need a leather needle, but I'd recommend testing that out prior to starting. So the plan here is that we're going to stitch about 1/8, 3mm away from the edge of the tab, and we're going to catch the 2 layers of the tab and the zip. Now you may wish to increase your stitch length here. Mine is on about 3.5. Because this is a top stitching, you're going to want to make sure that this looks nice and neat. And I'm just going to work this through the machine. If your machine struggles to feed it through, then I'd recommend perhaps using some stabilizer or something underneath or on top or both of the layers. And backstitch it at the start and at the end. And we'll do exactly the same for the top of the zip. This side's a little bit more tricky because the zip is open. You're probably going to want to unfasten the zip so that you can sew this neatly, but just make sure that both sides don't slip. And I'm working my way along. Now, what I'm using here is the edge of my zipper foot, and I've actually moved my needle over. So if you can do that, that's a great way. So I'm lining up the edge of the tab with the edge of the zipper foot. You want something that means that you can sew accurately across this, making sure that you're the same distance. Now my machine's made a slight funny sound here, so I'm simply going to use the hand wheel, turn that towards me just to get over that section. If you are working with a metal zipper, if you ever hear a noise like that, you must make sure that you stop, use the hand wheel, and just check what the needle is going into, because if it touches the metal, it will break. At the end, backstitch. Once you've attached the tab to either end of the zip, then we can move on to introducing the front and back of the bag. Please don't worry about the stitching across the tabs too much. The only part of the zip you're actually going to see and of the tab is the section that has got the teeth on it. So please don't worry if the edges don't match up. If you struggle sewing these on with your machine, another tip is to start in the centre and sew out to the edge. Start in the centre and sew out to the other edge. That may help feed the tab and the zip through your sewing machine. Now we're going to attach one side of the bag onto your zipper. So we're going to move one of these out of the way. Okay, so here is my leather, and that's nicely interfaced. I'm then going to take my zip and I'm going to position the zip with the right side facing up. So the zipper teeth are looking up at me. Now I'm going to take my piece of fabric, whether that be leather or a fabric of your choice, and I'm going to turn this over so that the wrong side is facing up. I'm going to position the right side of my leather onto the top of the zip so that the top edge of the leather matches up with the top edge of the zip. You're going to want to make sure that the zip is central. So you're going to want to take a measurement from the end of your fabric or piece of leather to the end of the zipper tab, and it needs to be the same on this side as it is on the other side. To show you clearly from this side, from the edge of the tab to the edge of the fabric, if you've done your measurements correctly, you should have 5/8 of an inch, 1.3 centimetres. That's so that we've got enough for a seam allowance down both edges, and that we've also got a little bit of a gap which allows us to poke out the zip and get nice neat corners here. As you can also see from the front, the tab extends a little bit. That's absolutely fine. The key here is that we're matching the top edge of the fabric with the top edge of the zip. If the tabs extend, that's fine. You're going to want to use bulldog clips or these wonder clips to hold this in place, because obviously you can't pin this. Now another thing you need to think about here before we go to the sewing machine, we're going to be stitching along the edge as close to the teeth as possible, and when this is finished it's going to look like this. So if you have a nap to your fabric, perhaps you're working with suede, or even if you have a directional print, you need to make sure here that the smoothness of the nap is going down that way, as is your print, because this is the top of the bag. Now you're going to want to start sewing from where the tab on the zip begins. Basically, you don't need to sew this blank bit of fabric, just from where the tab begins. Now I've moved my needle over so that it's on the left edge of my zipper foot. I'm going to be running the edge of the zipper foot down the edge of the teeth. So I'm sewing as close to this as I possibly can. You're going to want to take the grips out as you go, and I'm working with a smaller stitch length of 2.5 millimeters. Now you may find, depending on the size of your zipper pull, that you actually need to open this, and I think I'll need to do that for mine. So moving the fabric over, I'm going to open the zipper, and that will just give me a bit more space here. I'm working my way down, feeling constantly for where the edge of that zipper teeth or those zipper teeth are. Now, if you're worried about this, you're welcome to draw the line that you should be stitching on, if that would make it easier for you. Now I'm nearing the zipper pull now, so I'm going to leave the needle in, raise my zipper foot, and I should be able to get my hands in there to zip that zipper back up, and I've done that. There we go. And we're going to keep going all the way until we get to past the other end of the zipper tab. And we'll backstitch there just like we did at the beginning. Once you're happy that you have sewn along this edge accurately, and you are welcome to sew over yourself if you feel you need to get a little bit closer to the teeth. Now, worst case scenario is that if you sew too close and you're working with a metal zipper, you will probably break the needle. If you're working with a plastic zipper, you may find that you get away with it, you don't break the needle, but when it comes to unfastening and fastening your zip, it won't do that because you'll actually have sewn onto the teeth. So just double check at this stage to make sure that you haven't got any unpicking to do. Now we've got some top stitching to do. The top stitching is going to hold this edge down, attach it to the zipper below, and make everything look nice and neat. We're going to stitch along this edge, making sure we go through the zipper. Join me back at the sewing machine. To complete the top stitching, you're going to want to start at the edge of the fabric. So not where the end of the zipper or the tab is, but right at the edge of the fabric. You're going to want to find something on your machine that you can line up with to get a nice, accurate, straight edge of top stitching. I'm using the edge of my zipper foot here in line with the folded edge of the fabric, and I've moved my needle over so that I am 1/8, 3 millimeters away from this folded edge. Obviously, the distance that you do with your top stitching is up to you. You just need to make sure that you're consistent on both sides. I've also increased my stitch length to 3.5 millimeters, but again, you might want to test this on your machine to see what looks good. Now I'm going to feed this through the machine, backstitch at the start and at the end. Just one backstitch to be nice and neat here. Again, you may need to unzip your zip to get past. I don't think I'm going to need to. Maybe let's do it just in case. It will be a bit thick as you go over the tab, so use the hand wheel on your machine if you need to. Now I'm going to zip that back up. So needle in, lift foot, zip up, foot down. And continue your way along. Now this is where you can use some top stitching thread for some detail if you want. You can even put 2 threads through the top of the machine if you would like to, so that you have a thicker finish to your top stitching. At the end, we're going to do a single back stitch again just to secure it. Once you're happy with your top stitching, we're ready to attach the second side. You're going to take the second side and we're going to turn this so that the right side is facing down, wrong side facing up. And you're going to position the top edge of your fabric along the top edge of the zip. Again, the little tabs might stick out and that isn't a problem at all. The other thing you need to think about here is you need to have that same measurement. So from the tab to the end needs to be the same measurement on both sides as it was on the first side. And this should mean that the side seams of both layers of your leather match up. You don't want this sort of shifting over like this with the edge of leather creeping out there. Remember also that you need to make sure when this is sewn and turned back that your nap is going in the right direction, or that your pattern is going in the correct direction. Now, I also wanted to share a technique with you that will hopefully help when you're attaching the tabs and when you're attaching the fabric onto the zip, especially if you're using a difficult fabric like leather, which you can't pin. And that's adhesive. In this case, we're looking at this double-sided basting tape. Now, if you were to peel this off, just like sticky tape, it's sticky on the one side and it's currently got sort of a plastic coating on the other side. Now, all I've done is positioned this onto the side of my zipper that I'm attaching my next piece of fabric. Make sure here, though, that you don't position the tape too close to the zipper teeth. If you look at the other side that I've already sewn on, there's about an 1/8, a 3mm, just under that of space of the zipper tape before the fabric. So you don't want to put the sticky tape right up to the teeth, because that could result in having problems with actually unzipping the zipper, and you might be able to see it when you've finished. So I've just backed it away enough so that I'm not going to see this when I'm done. Press that on nicely. Then you're going to peel off the top layer. And you should be left with sort of a clear sticky tape on the zip. Now I'm going to position my fabric where I want to sew it, making sure that I make it central and that the top edge is in line with the top of the zip. And that you can sort of reposition this, so I would do it lightly, make sure it's in place, and then you can press a little bit harder. If you have any of the sticky tape sort of sticking out like I do here, because the tape's a little bit wider than I require for it to be, then you can obviously trim that off. Make sure you do that with your paper scissors. So this could be great for helping to attach the zipper and for sewing the tabs. The other thing that you can use, and that's probably better for sewing the tabs, is a repositionable adhesive spray. Something like this. This spray you can spray onto the wrong side of your fabric and then you can stick it on. I would, however, only recommend that you use it for the tabs, because you'll find that it's quite difficult to just spray enough on so that you're just attaching the top part of this piece of fabric. If you decide to use some adhesive spray, make sure that you cover your table first with some scrap paper, because you don't want to get it everywhere. So because I've stuck this edge down, I'm now ready to go and sew it. I'm going to do exactly the same as we did before. We're going to be working along, sewing as close to the teeth as possible. I'm then going to fold it over and I'm going to top stitch. You don't need to remove the basting tape once you've done this. That will be included inside the seam. When you get to this point and you finish your top stitching, join me back here and I will show you what to do next. And now you can see that I've attached both sides and top stitched both sides. Just a point to add about the basting tape that we were talking about a second ago. Just be careful with your needle with this, because it can make the needle on the sewing machine a little bit gummy and sticky. So keep an eye on that and obviously replace it when you need to. Another thing to add is, because of that, I'd recommend not using it all the time. Just use it where you need it, where you're struggling, and perhaps keep a separate needle for when you're using it. The next step is to sew the sides and the bottom of the bag together. So you're simply going to position the bag with the right sides together. Before you do this, make sure that you open the zip so that you have the ability to turn it around afterwards. Now, the most important thing here is that you need to match up the top edge of both bits of fabric. We're going to sew this from the top down to the bottom, and we'll do the same on the other side so that you don't get any slip along this edge. You're going to use your Wonder clips or Bulldog clips to position everything in place. Matching up the bottom edges as well. Now you're going to sew from the top backwards and forwards, almost on and off, to make sure that we don't have a hole here, down to the bottom. and again backwards and forwards. If you're working in inches, you've got a 1/2 inch seam allowance here. If you're working in centimetres, it should be 1 centimetre. And that should leave you with a small amount spare before the tab at the end of the zipper. You should have approximately 1/8 or 3 millimetres free between the stitching down this side and the tab. Another thing to point out is at the bottom edge, when you backstitch, please make sure that you sort of backstitch a little bit further than you normally would, because in a second we're going to be sewing across the bottom and then we're going to be trimming off the corners. So when we cut the corners, we want to make sure that we don't have a weak point. So make sure that you sort of backwards and forwards, that's same seam allowance, 1/2 inch or 1 centimetre below from the bottom. I have now pinned both sides so that I'm ready to sew those on the sewing machine. If you prefer, you're more than welcome to draw on your stitching line if you think that would help you. Otherwise, join me at the machine and I'll share with you some tips and techniques for doing this. So we're starting at the top edge where the zip is, and you've got the 2 layers that have been top stitched of your fabric or leather. You're going to want to make sure that they don't move, so you're going to want to do a backwards and forward stitch and almost sew off so that the 2 layers are one on top of each other. The rest of the way, I'm going to be working with my 1/2 inch seam allowance, and I'm going to be stitching that all the way down. Now here I'm using a walking foot, and I would use a walking foot whenever possible when sewing with leather. It's just going to help you, the machine, to pull the fabric through and to move it through better and to stop any of the layers shifting. And I'm following the guide on the edge of my sewing machine. And we're going to do this all the way down to the bottom edge where we're going to complete that back stitch. Also to note, I'm doing the smaller standard stitch length of 2.5 millimeters. Now, when we get to the end here, as I mentioned, you need to make sure that you back stitch far enough so that you're sealing that point where we're going to be sewing across in a minute. So the 1/2 inch or 1 centimeter from the edge. And then we can pull that out of the machine and do exactly the same on the other side. Now on some machines you may find that your walking foot doesn't allow you to get close enough to the tab. In those cases you're going to need to go back to your zipper foot. Make sure when you're using this that the needle's in the correct position for you to be using your markings on the side here. Again, backstitch and forward stitch across that top edge, trying to make sure that they don't move. You may have a little bit more trouble without the walking foot, so in that case you're just going to need to take it slowly, use the hand wheel on the machine when you need to help move everything forward, and lift the foot as well if you need to sort of move the fabric underneath. At the end, remember to backstitch just like we did on the last one, making sure to come back far enough to secure it. The final step is going to be to sew along the bottom of the bag, again following your 1/2 inch or 1 centimeter seam allowance. You should be able to use your walking foot for this if you have one. Make sure again that you really backstitch over where that stitching comes across you horizontally to make sure that that's really nice and secure. Work your way across the bottom, again using 2.5mm stitch length, and backstitch when you get to the other end. Make sure that the 2 layers of fabric or leather are on top of one another here. Use the clips if you would like to. So again, backstitch going over the horizontal stitching to be nice and secure, and we can come out and I'm going to show you what you've got left to do. The final step that we just did on the sewing machine was to sew across the bottom edge. Again, following the same seam allowance, 1/2 inch or 1 centimeter, and making sure to backstitch at the start and at the end, so almost sewing over those horizontal lines so that when we trim the corners off in a second, that's all nice and secure. The final step before turning this around is to trim down the seam allowances. You're going to want to do this to reduce the bulk. You want to trim them to about 1/8, 3 millimeters. You can go quite close. And obviously we don't want them unsightly inside your little bag. And again, we're going to trim across the top of this edge here. We can also do this across the bottom. And you can also trim off the corners. cutting quite close, 1/8 mil away from the stitching, and this is why we did that back stitching, to stop these from coming undone. You're also going to want to trim off any excess tab bits in line with the edge of the zip, just to give a nice neat finish. And anything else that's sort of causing you any grief on the inside, feel free to trim away, as long as it's not going to be seen on the outside. One last thing to add here is that the reason why we didn't stitch down, around and back up is because if we had done that, you'll find that these edges don't quite match up, and it can result in something that doesn't look quite as professional. So that's the reason behind why we stitched down on both sides, to make sure that these bulky edges line up perfectly when you turn it around, and then obviously across the bottom afterwards. I hope that clears it up if you had a question regarding that. Once the trimming is complete, it's time to turn it around. That's why we had to leave that zip open earlier on, making sure that we poke out all those corners. So I'm going to do finger to thumb here and really try and poke those corners out. The same goes for the little bits of the tab. Really make sure that you poke out those bits too. If you're worried about any of the seams anywhere, or if you're perhaps going to use this for something that could be heavy, please feel free to stitch again on top of the stitching that you've already done, or perhaps do a smaller stitch length, say 1.5 millimeters, for some security. I recommend using a point turner to get in and really poke those corners out. All 4 corners should have a nice finish to them. And there you have it, a super cute leather purse. I really hope you enjoyed the tutorial and that you feel more confident working with a different fabric like leather that perhaps you haven't worked with before, and that you've had fun making these cute leather purses that you can give away as gifts to friends or perhaps keep for yourself. Thank you for watching, and good luck with your sewing.